of the Economics Department at the New School for Social Research. I'm Shima Tejani. I'm a PhD student at the New School, and I'm also a research assistant at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis. A very warm welcome to you all. The title of our panel for today is Global Perspective, Inequality and the Crisis in Developing Countries. We have a very distinguished set of panelists with us today. Professor Anwar Sheikh, Professor Eileen Grable, Professor Sanjay Reddy, and Professor Lopamudra Banerjee. Each panelist will be making remarks for approximately 15 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. Unfortunately, Dr. Milanovic could not be with us here today, and he sends his regrets. But we still hope to have a really stimulating and interesting discussion. Our first speaker will be Professor Anwar Sheikh. Professor Sheikh is, as you all know, teaching at the New School for Social Research. He is an associate editor of the Cambridge Journal of Economics and was a senior scholar and member of the macro modeling team at the Levy Institute of Bar College from 2000 to 2005. He is the author of 3 books, the most recent being Globalization and the Myths of Free Trade. He has written on international trade, finance theory, political economy, US macroeconomic policy, the welfare state, growth theory, inflation theory, crisis theory, and inequality on the world scale, as well as global economic crises. Professor Sheikh will be talking to us about global aspects of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva, and thank you to the students for arranging this fabulous conference. It's had quite an impact, I can see, seeing all these wonderful people. 15 minutes is, as every panelist knows, difficult to cover the history of the world and all its implications and all of that, so we have to do it in a kind of schematic way. But I want to make some central points. One is about the origin of the crisis, and the second set will be about the impact of the crisis on a global scale, and the third set will be about what might be done. And there'll be roughly 5 minutes each, hopefully. The first point I want to make is that this crisis arose in the advanced world, and that's a very important thing to understand, because if you were to pick up a textbook anywhere, you'd see the advanced world as this wonderful, perfect machine just chugging along. And I want to come later to the culpability of the economics profession in this fantasy, but chugging along and then subject to shocks here and there, but nothing like falling apart. So I want to argue that, in fact, the history of the advanced world predisposes us to expect exactly this. That what we are getting is, in fact, a standard, recurrent pattern, which is called historically a Great Depression. Now, as I said, one has to be very schematic in presenting this, and I hope to post a paper on my homepage, which will have this argument in some more detail and some more empirical evidence. But the main point is that if you look at terms of global crises of this sort, you see they occur with surprising regularity. Regularity meaning not that they come on schedule, but that they stay within a certain dimensional box of 30 to 45 years. And so we have those in the late 1840s, 1873 onward, 1930s, 1968. Someone mentioned that those of us who were around in the 70s knew that there was much discussion across the advanced countries about whether this was, in quotations, it. And what the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times meant by it was the Great Depression, of course, because there were bankruptcies, business failures, high unemployment, and in effect, many countries got out of the crisis by inflation, but not all. Countries like Japan followed a different path. The countries like the US and UK followed the path of massive jumps in unemployment, beating down of labor, dismantling of the part of the state which supported progressive and labor activities, and inflation. Inflation was a very important means of making workers lose ground because their wages didn't keep up, and making many people, older people and so on, lose ground. So I want to then move to what is a central factor that might account for a recurrent pattern in a system that evolves all the time. Capitalism is like a virus. Its sheath is constantly evolving. And so no matter what defenses, i.e. structures you put to contain it, it constantly evolves to get around them. And at the heart of this structure is profitability. Very important point. What drives this system is profitability. And more concretely, what drives it is the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. This difference between the profit rate and the interest rate is something that is central to the arguments of Keynes, of Marx, and most classical economists in one form, Smith and Ricardo and so on. So I want to argue that this crisis was caused by the normal functioning of profitability, but we need to look more concretely at what that functioning was, that it was not in fact caused by the mortgage crisis. It was true that the mortgage crisis triggered a huge bubble, and burst a huge bubble, so it was a trigger in that sense. But that bubble itself was built on a boom that lasted from the early 1980s up to the late 2005-2006 period. And I want to try to analyze what caused the boom and why the boom eventually collapsed. It is important also that concrete historical events play a role in this. For instance, the undoing of regulation in the United States, allowing banks to invest in risky activities, of course, implicated many more financial institutions in the bubble than would have been otherwise. But not all capitalist countries did this. Canada, for instance, had a different banking structure, a different mortgage structure, and has therefore felt the impact of this crisis much less on the financial structure. It has, of course, felt it on exports, which are global. So, the second part of this story is, of course, that since the driver, I'm sorry, I'm skipping a little bit. So what we're experiencing is a structural crisis and a recurrent one. And I want to say that what we are now entering is a Great Depression once again, pretty much on schedule, within the 40 to 50, 45-year range. And that I think it's going to last a long time, in case I forget to say that it's not going to be something that will be green shooted out, as you see every day in the papers. Every uptick, the newspapers seize on that and say, yes, the recovery is beginning. And of course, when the downtick comes, they say, oh, well, it's not beginning. First point, theoretical point. Accumulation is a function of the rate of profit of enterprise. That term is Marx's term. The excess of the profit rate over the interest rate. This number G sub k is just the rate of accumulation, the rate of growth of capital, the growth of capital. And the essential argument in the classical tradition, and also in Keynes, is that the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate is what creates the viability of accumulation. This is the driver of the animal spirits, because R in Marx is the general profit rate and I is the interest rate. But in Keynes, the R represents the marginal efficiency of investment and I represents the interest rate. So again, Keynes focuses on the short run, but these variables are very crucial to the story. And there's a subsidiary argument which I'm going to have to probably skip, which is that movements of this variable create a moment where the amount of real profit becomes stagnant. And that is, in effect, where the R is equal to the I. Another way to put it is that the incentive for accumulation disappears, and that moment is where the system changes behavior, undergoes what I call a phase change from healthy growth or apparently healthy growth to unhealthy accumulation and decline and series of crises. And the quote from Warren Buffett is lovely, because it's extremely apropos these days. So I'm going to show you data, path of the profit rate, interest rate, the difference between the two, which is the key variable, the total amount of profit of enterprise, and then I want to talk about real wages, productivity, and the real income. Some of it is covering material before, so that was presented in the last session. Here is the first key variable from a classical point of view, and I would argue from a Keynesian point of view too. Joan Robinson would have been perfectly happy with this picture. You can see that there is a long-term decline in profitability, which is subject to many fluctuations. And the one fluctuation which I'd like to point out to you, that one that begins with